Okay, I think we shall start. Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the 5th panel discussion on Chinese regional cinemas. This panel discussion is part of the 10 panel discussions from Odyssey Chinese cinema season. So this is the Odyssey Chinese cinema season is the largest Chinese film festival in 2022 in Europe, which contains 8 curated sessions and over 50 or 60 films from the 10th of May to the 10th of June. If you're interested, please check it out at odysseychinesecinema.uk. I have also put the link of the festival in our chat. So this panel discussion is supported by UK-China Film Club, a nonprofit organization aiming cross-cultural conversation between the UK and the Greater China. Today's panel is about Chinese regional cinema. I'm really delighted to invite Dr. Zhaoyu Zhu to be our guest speaker. Dr. Zhaoyu Zhu is the teaching fellow of communication and cultural studies at University of Nottingham, Ningbo, China. He gained his Ph.D. in King's College London, and his research interests are Chinese film technology and media. Welcome to be here. So today's panel discussion is structured as follows. So this panel discussion begins with the presentation of Dr. Zhaoyu Zhu, who introduced and contextualized our topic, the Chinese regional cinemas, and how we can approach it for roughly 30 minutes. Then Zhaoyu and I will briefly discuss the topic based on his presentation. And finally, the audiences will also have a chance to ask questions or share your opinion on the Chinese regional cinema from the chat, or you can just turn on your microphone at the end. Okay, now let's welcome Dr. Zhaoyu Zhu.
Okay, good. Thank you very much to Franklin, and thank you very much to the UK-China Club. And I'm Dr. Zhaoyu Zhu, and I feel really honored and come to here to present one of my working in progress paper about the Chinese regional cinema. But actually that paper is about the locality and regionality of Chinese cinemas. So today I just want to show a part of this research about the locality and regionality of Chinese cinema. But I do not want to repeat too much things, theoretical in this lovely Friday night. So probably I just want to give our audiences some eye-openers or some appetite for you to explore, the local representations or regional representations in the Chinese cinemas. So I hope this presentation could work really well in this way. Okay, so now I would like to share my presentation slides. All right. So today, I think my presentation would be composed of 3 parts. So first thing, I would like to talk briefly about the locality and regionality in Chinese cinemas. So in this paper, I argue that this locality and regionality is usually, ignored, by the scholarship of the Chinese cinemas. So probably a majority of Chinese cinema research still, dominantly just look at, the nationalhood or the transnationality of Chinese cinema. So probably they just emphasize, the Chinese cinema as, a homogeneous entity, which doesn't have, the diversity or the heterogeneity, inside. But recently I also found that some scholars try to emphasize the dialect cinemas, or also emphasize something like the mother language cinemas, which appears in the Chinese films, probably the Tibetan new waves. So if you are really familiar with Tibetan, some filmmakers from Tibet, so probably you would know that the film is completely, spoken in the Tibetan, which is another kind of language, different from, the Chinese, from the Mandarin. But I think this kind of, the classification based on the language is not enough to think about the locality and the regionality in Chinese cinema. So probably in this research, I would like to emphasize some new models to look at the locality and regionality in Chinese cinema, based on the recent, theoretical writings, in our Chinese academy, Chinese academia of Chinese films. So because it seems that in the last few years, there are a lot like discussions in Chinese about these topics. So then probably I would like to review the history of Chinese films from these spatial, local, regional perspectives to show you why this locality and regionality is really important in the Chinese film history. And finally, I would like to look at the regional new waves, because this is a really important part of these film series. So I would like to use the films curated in these screening series as some examples to give you some interpretations of how this region is shown, how it's showing in these exemplar films. Okay, so here are some really fundamental facts about the Chinese cinemas. So you could find some common characteristics of them. So they emphasize this nationhood or nationality or Chinese cinema. Why I think this emphasis on Chinese nationhood is really predominant in the scholarship of Chinese cinema, because most of the scholarship is in the English academia. So probably from a Western perspective, the Chinese films usually is considered into the category of the foreign language films or or international films, right? So probably these Chinese films, probably they would be considered as a whole. They would be considered holistically, which probably have a difference which have a huge difference from the European films or American films, because in the English spoken academia, the European films or the Anglophone films are probably the most what the most scholarships write about. So in this way, this emphasis of the Chinese nationality is usually highlighted, in the English spoken academics. So look at these books. So probably you can find that they just use the word like national or like China on screen or like transnational or the Sinophone. I think Sinophone, this term is quite interesting because it's just trying to differentiate the China's from the other nations by the language, because you probably have heard about Anglophone or Francophone. So probably they emphasize a certain common culture that the people who speak the same language share. So probably they use these Sinophone to think about the culture that the people who speak Chinese commonly have, right? So, but usually this Sinophone term is used to describe about the diasporic Chinese cinema, the people who probably make their films or produce some texts outside of China. So they use this Sinophone to emphasize these linguistic root of their cultural or media productions. So this is how they use the Sinophone. Also, in the Chinese film history, we already have this kind of a paradigm, which emphasizes the generational narratives. So if you are familiar with Chinese cinema, you would be familiar with some term like the 5th generation filmmakers or the 6th generation filmmakers. Actually, probably they would put the filmmakers into linear narratives, which is separated into different generations. So probably it's just trying to form a uniformity in the Chinese cinema that, okay, or history of Chinese cinema is developed in these, timeline, these, uniform timeline. All the filmmakers probably they are just one part of these timeline. But actually, nowadays, a lot of people just are feel cynical about these, generation narratives. So probably you, nowadays, you never heard about anything like the seventh generation filmmakers, because we found out, beyond these generation filmmakers, we have a really diverse kind of filmmakings, which was ignored in the conventional narratives of Chinese cinemas. So this why these generational narratives right now become more outdated, and also a lot of people try to emphasize the context behind the filmmaking rather than this kind of linear narrative in the Chinese film history. So now I would like to think about the locality and regionality. Actually, I think locality and the regionality could be a really good concept to deconstruct the two models that I just mentioned. Because one model, look at that nationality, another is that kind of generational narrative. So probably we should put the filmmakings in a certain context, which is decarnated by space, decarnated by the territory. So there are two words like locality and regionality. So locality probably look at a certain location, probably one city, right? Or maybe one province, which is more local. But another is a regionality. Yeah, so actually in China, we usually separate the China into different regionality, right? So Northeast China, Northeast China, Northwest China. So probably these regions, they probably have some common characteristics in the geography, in climate, or in their, forms of the dialectics, right? The dialects, right? So probably their dialects sound a little bit similar in a certain region, right? So, and nowadays, we do not have a huge number of scholarship looking at, the locality and regionality in Chinese cinema. So what I could have found probably is just this book, Signifying the Local, is written by a scholar working at the Georgia Tech. So actually, she's an American scholar. She writes about the the media productions rendered in the local language in mainland China. But this is a really general research about the local media productions in the local language. But we do not have any publications just focus on the film productions in local language or in local context. So this is a huge issue. So if I think this film, if you studied film Chinese cinema before, or if you are a huge film fan, so probably you have watched this film. This is a Huang Di. So in English, it's called Yellow Earth. This is the fourth film which is selected into the international film festivals. The first Chinese film which was selected into the International Film Festival in the 1980s. So these films made the Chinese cinema big at that time. But actually, this film was usually considered as a paradigm of Chinese cinemas in the scholarship, also in the in the international cinephilia. But in China, when we read the title of this film, Huang Di, right, Yellow Earth, so it could remind us of the context where this film was made. So it reminds us a place called the Yellow Earth Plateau or the Lost Plateau, Huangtu Gaoyuan, which is in the north, in the Shanxi province. Yeah. So it reminds us a certain region where this film was made. So a lot of Chinese audiences, when they viewed these films, they would know, okay, this film was made in this, environment, in this context of the Lost Plateau, the Yellow Earth Plateau. They would know this film was made in Shanxi. But for the foreign audiences, probably they just feel like this just has a Chinese characteristics, right? So I guess probably there would be a difference between the viewership of the Chinese film. If the people who view the films have some knowledge, about the geography of China, so probably they would know more about these spatial, context of the film, right? So this is why I think, the geography knowledge is a really important component in the viewership, in the reception of Chinese cinemas. But this thing is generally ignored in contemporary, film scholarship. Okay, so now I would like to use this kind of perspective to reconstruct the Chinese film history. So firstly, I would like to reinterpret the history of the film before the socialist period, which is before 1949. Okay, so at the time, the China was led by the nationalist party, the Kuomintang. So the capital was in Nanjing. So at the time, it's a predominantly a capitalist country. So at the time, the film productions probably, for entertainment. Most of the films produced at the time were for entertainment. And the Chinese films and trying to compete with the Hollywood films imported to China at the time. So the film productions was mainly based in Shanghai, So if you take the space, if you take these kind of local context into the consideration, so probably you could say at that time, the films are mostly Shanghainese films because it tried to emphasize, the urban representation of Shanghai. Because the most film companies were, located at Shanghai. So yes, so I would like to use an example to let you think about these Shanghainese urban representation in the films made in that year. So this film is called New Women. So I would like to use a small sequence to give you some appetite in this way. Oh, it probably paused. Yeah, here it is. Oh, this one. Yeah. Look at that. Actually, this film is about women. It's about the revolt of the women's at that times. They try to how to say oppose the male gaze, also the male dominance. So actually, this film is really feminist, based the contemporary thinking. But just now you found this clip, so you can see a lot of urban image of Shanghai. So if you have been to Shanghai, you probably found that the architecture which is located at the Bund, right? The Bund, that building is the Shanghai Customs building. So that building probably is one of the most famous architecture in Shanghai. Yeah. So this film is just trying to emphasize this urban image of Shanghai. Also, you can look at a lot like, like trolleys, or also some really famous architectures, in Shanghai. So remind you that this film was set in Shanghai. Yes. So at the time, the Shanghai segment is really important. So we could say, the film is Shanghainese cinema. But recently there's research, trying to, challenge these thoughts, because some scholars found out there is a filmmaking in Sichuan province, in probably you know the Sichuan food, which is really spicy. But yeah, in Chengdu there are some like smaller film studios. In Tianjin, there are film studio, where is my hometown, but it's probably the second largest cities in the Republican era. So at the time, Tianjin also has some entertainment-oriented filmmaking. So probably, the space of Chinese cinema now is expanded. I think the understanding of the space, has been understanding in recent years because of new scholarships, So yeah. So this is why I think the space is really important. This locality and regionality is important to reinterpret this history. Oh, okay. So now let's go to another era. Is the era after the the establishment of the socialist regime. So in the early social era, actually the filmmaking still followed the Republic era. So the film production, on one hand, was based on Shanghai. Yeah, there was the Shanghai Film Studio. And another part is the Changchun Film Studio, is in the Northeast China. But actually, because, at that time, the Changchun in the Republic era is occupied by Japanese. It's the Manchukuo, which is the public regime of the Japanese government in China. So they left heritage of the filmmaking, and then the Communist Party just confiscated this heritage from the Manchukuo, from the Japanese filmmaking, and to build their first film studio, which is the the Changchun Film Studio. Also because the Beijing, after the socialist regime, it became the capital. So a new film studio was established in Beijing. It's called the Beijing Film Studio. But in the 1958, there was a huge transformation, because there was a new policy called the Plan on the Establishment of Film Studios in Provinces, Municipalities, and Autonomous Regions. So it means that the provincial government, the provincial Ministry of Culture have the authority to build the local networks for the production and the distribution of films. Okay, so there was a huge change in the the landscape of the filmmakings after 1958. So firstly, I would like to show this map. So this is a Chinese map after the establishment of the socialist regime. So yeah, so look at that. So probably, most of the provinces have established their local film studios. Yes. So, yeah. So probably at the time we have 20 or 30 film studios in different cities, in different provinces. So yeah. So this is how the filmmaking in China looks like since 1958. But yes, actually most studios actually didn't produce too many projects before the the economic reform, because there was economic reforms, bring in the Western capital, bring in the market economies. into China in 1979. But before the 1979, a majority of these local film producers, they just produce, the newsreels, because before the 1980s, actually the television was not popular, right? So the cinema become the most mainstream media for the public to know the news. So yeah, the local film studios probably at the time, their main mission, their main task is to produce newsreels or documentaries, and to show, to report something to the public. But after the 1980s, actually, the different film studios in different provinces, they produce a lot of films. But this is how, the landscape of filmmaking looks like, so it's quite, provincial, it's quite localized. So why this can happen? Because, since the 1950s, actually, all media productions was further localized. In China, I think this is really different from the UK, because probably in UK you have the public service media, BBC, you have some national, national media producer like ITV or like Channel 4. But in China, we have these, nationalized, media producer like CCTV, which is a counterpart of the BBC. But mostly in different provinces, we also have these provincial media producers, right? So in different provinces, they would have a radio station, they would have their, television station. So followed by these kind of phenomena, of course, the film studios were established in, in different provinces. Okay, so now I would like to link the different two parts about the, localized film studios and the regional new waves, because in my opinion, I feel like these, the local film studios has a huge relation with the, the new waves happening in the 1980s and nowadays. For example, about the fifth generation directors. So actually, most of these filmmakers, they have a huge relation with these film studios in Guangxi. So Guangxi actually is in the west of the Canton. Canton is in the South China, right? So Guangzhou, like Shenzhen, right? So if you know the geography, you would know they are in the South China, the most southern part of China. But on the west of the Canton, there is a province called Guangxi. But the Guangxi film studios, actually, in the 1980s, they incubated a lot of film directors, because the leader of these film studios went to the film schools to hire a lot of young filmmakers to let them make their films. So this is why these fifth generation directors appeared, because these studios, gave these young filmmakers a high degree of creative autonomy. Without the effort of these provincial film studios, we would never have, these fifth generation film directors. Also nowadays, in China, we have this Inner Mongolia new wave, because in the late 2000s and in the early 2010s, we have a lot, filmmakers coming from Inner Mongolia making their films, and their films also win a lot of awards in some film festival in China, like first. Also, their films were awarded, internationally. But I found that their filmmaking has a huge relation with this film studio, Inner Mongolia Film Studio. Some of these filmmakers, they were the children of some directors who made a film in these film studios. So they were, educated since the childhood in this kind of familial background. Also, some filmmakers, coming from these film studio, they establish their companies. They start up some like companies, media companies, and they help and fund the young filmmakers to make their films. So there is some relationship between these Inner Mongolia film studio and the new waves happening in the Inner Mongolia. Also nowadays, I think the contemporary art cinema, we have this kind of characteristics. It's called regional new waves. So based on my search online, I found there are these several types of new waves, like Northeast New Wave, like Hangzhou New Wave, but Hangzhou, some people also call it Zhejiang New Wave because Hangzhou is the capital of Zhejiang province. Also, we have the Inner Mongolia New Wave. Some scholars also emphasize, there is the South New Wave because the majority of the new art house films which got attention from publics were made in the South, including the Southwest China, East China, and also the Canton, right? So they just put these, different milieux of filmmaking together and to form this South New Wave. But there are a huge discussion about these new waves, why it become a new wave, or why this, why it's not a new wave. Some people also don't like this idea, saying, okay, this kind of new emergent, filmmaking as a new wave. But we can say that nowadays the films makings, especially the filmmaking of the art house films, become regionalized, become localized. So now I would like to use some examples from these screening series of Chinese regional cinemas in Odyssey as an example to introduce some characteristics in the regional new waves. Okay, the first one is the Hangzhou New Wave. Okay, so Hangzhou actually is one of the highest populated city in China nowadays. It's probably the 5th largest city. And so in 2020, and there is a screening series organized in the UK saying that the Hangzhou New Cinema. So I just quoted some description from these screening series. So it says, okay, Hangzhou acts as the modern capital of the Zhejiang province. It's a serene vistas along West Lake, having inspired poetry and folklore for generations. Hangzhou is also home to China's top high-tech industries with a huge populations, which has led to rapid urban renewal and several economic changes. Okay, these combined qualities of natural beauty and modernity converge to form a city which has fostered the development of new directors who have created striking fresh films. Okay, so look at that, you can find that, okay, this city actually is really famous for its natural scenery, but nowadays, because of urbanization, because of economic development, it becomes more and more populated. It becomes the huge cities. So in the Hangzhou New Waves, so there is a common feature in this filmmaking to emphasize, this tension between the, the hyper-urbanization and the natural scenery, which makes the Hangzhou popular. So, for example, this is the films made in 2020, which won the Golden Tiger in Rotterdam Film Festivals. You can look at this image. So, newlywed just positioned at the centers, at a natural scenarios. Actually, this scene was made in an island inside the West Lake. West Lake is a really famous tourist spot. But from this image, you can find out there is an implication, saying that, okay, these people, become invaded and they interfere into, the natural sceneries, right? So I think this image just is a metaphor to let the audience think about, the urbanization in Hangzhou, also the tension between, the urbanization and this natural scenery in this city. As a look at this image, right? So it's about demolition. Of course, it just refers to the urbanization. Also, these filmmakers use this negative image, right, to emphasize, how the urbanization, changed Hangzhou. Okay, so now probably I don't want to show too much from this film. Oh, so probably I just would like to show, some clips, in these films curated in our film series. So you can find out probably this filmmaker who made the drilling in the Fuchun Mountains. So it emphasized a harmonious relationship between the human and the nature, in this city. Okay, so okay, so drilling in the Fuchun Mountains was usually considered as, the one of the masterpiece in the Hangzhou New Waves. So, but it emphasized a really different idea from, the last film I showed to you, right? So, but the both films probably just think about how the urbanization, changed the people's life and also changed the people's understanding of the nature. So now I also would like to show something about the Northeast New Wave. Actually, Northeast New Wave. Okay, about Northeast New Wave. So because Northeast China actually was originally a, industrial base in the early socialist period. Northeast China was famous for its fertile land resources, as well as for its, industrial construction, which is left over by the Japanese. So the early industrial construction project, which was sponsored by the socialist government, was located there. But nowadays, after the economic reform, a lot of industries, state-owned industries, closed down. So it just leave the Northeast China this kind of image, which is really, prevalent in the contemporary art house cinemas. For example, the West of the Track or the Piano in the Factory. So they usually emphasize, the aesthetics industrial roots. But when I found out more films made in this context, I found that they usually emphasize a coldness because the Northeast China is the most coldest part of China, especially in the winter. The temperature is nearly, minus 10 degrees. So it's usually snowy, in the winter in this area. But the characters showing in these films, they also same as this natural scenario. So probably they also have a kind of characteristics of the mental coldness, or probably they really they have an apathy, of the society, of this social transformation. So I want to emphasize this effect of coldness, but this is about another, working in progress paper I'm working on. So in this film series, we would show these films with STEM tools. So actually this film was set in the border of China and Northeast. So in this film, you can find out a lot like, posters written in Korean. But this film also emphasized the wisdom tools. So because we do not have too much time, so probably I just want to show this image to you so you can see that it's a snowy scenario, right? So it's also emphasized the coldness, this kind of cold environmental coldness in the Northeast China. But when you watch this film, you also feel these characters are detached from these, society, from the social environment. So this film also emphasizes this kind of effect of coldness. So I think our time is nearly running out, but finally, I want to introduce a little bit about these two films. So this film actually they cannot be categorized into any regional new waves, but nowadays probably apart from the regional new waves, we also have a lot of film making in the variety of Chinese cities. For example, The Great Happiness was set in Xining, and The Drift in Life was set in Suzhou. So these films probably also shows the local representations of the cities where this film is produced. So if you want to explore more, so please just see these films in this film series, and to know how the Xining and the Suzhou looks like, and how the dialects of the Xining people and also the people from Suzhou, how their dialects sound like. Also, they are really different from the Mandarin. So in the conclusion, I just want to leave this statement. So Chinese cinema is naturally categorized as a polylocal. A local and regional awareness is required in reviewing and re-narrating the history of Chinese cinema. On one hand, locality and regionality redefine filmmaking as a production of culture under a certain context, demarcated by the territorial boundaries and the linguistic difference. On the other hand, locality and regionality are methods which could deeply connected with the which could deeply connect the filmmaking and the film reception with the local historical context and the indexical film space, as well as the construction of knowledge and the spatial identification. So that's all my presentation. Thank you very much for your listening.
Thank you, Zhaoyu. Thank you for your brilliant presentation on this quite innovative topic and approach. I think your point of view, especially when you show us like the film studios all around China, is fascinating. It is true that many Western scholars still treat Chinese cinema as a whole or analyze it from neither generations perspective or from the major cities like early Shanghai or contemporary Beijing. But you have shown us that Chinese cinema can be also approached from a regional perspective, like spatial way, right? So now I think maybe we can start to elaborate more on like your notion of regional cinema. So what are the characteristics do you think are called regional cinema? Can a film be classified as a regional film when just shooting that region, or what other factors shall we consider also?
Oh, thank you for your questions. So I think in this presentation, I would like to emphasize the regional in this part about the regional new waves. So why there is a regional new waves? Because a lot of filmmakers, they form a community of filmmakings in their region. So probably in a certain time, and their films simultaneously were awarded in the film festivals nationally or internationally. Also, their films probably also show the audience a certain sense or feeling that the audiences could identify, in which the audiences could identify some characteristics of a certain region, right? So, for example, about Northeast, right? The Northeast. So if you see the films from like Genjun, also the or Wang Bing, right? Wang Bing. So probably you would have found out, okay, they already just set the films in the industrial ruins, or also they would like to show the snowy days, this kind of natural environment in the Northeast region. So this is why I want to say about the regional. So there are two responses. The first one is about their production context. They are produced in a certain region. A second thing is about the film reception, because if the audiences are familiar with the geography, whether whether the natural geography or the human geography, so they could identify some elements in these films. We how to say, identify some regional characteristics from the elements of the films. Does it make sense to you? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I think how in the film, how people are connected with that city, which is somehow quite unique. And when I check some comments, like on some film platform, like Douban, one of the largest film review platforms in China, I found that in many like Chinese art films, many audiences from that region starts to comment and say, oh, like this film reminds me some of my early memories or some of my living conditions, which is quite unique compared to other regions. So I think this sense of reminiscence is important for audiences, especially like their subjective feelings and experience. What do you, like this?
Also, yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Very good. Very good.
Just
you want me to say something? Yes, I think the reminiscence is a really good word. But sometimes our feelings, sometimes it's constructed by our knowledge, because our knowledge probably is constructed in a certain way. It's constructed by the education we received since our childhood. So definitely since our primary school. So probably for a lot of Chinese students, probably they have started learning about geography, learning about how the different places look like in the books. But of course, I believe for the British audiences, for the British students, if for maybe since their childhood, they also study about how the geography of Britain looks like, and how the different regions of the Britain looks like, right? So yes, I think this is about knowledge. So, but sometimes knowledge could give us different understanding of the films. So this is why probably when the Chinese audiences watch some like British film like Transporting, right? Probably they just feel like, oh, this film is made by British filmmaker, but they cannot recognize this film is made in Glasgow. But when a British audiences look at that film, they would say, okay, oh, this character is from Glasgow, right?
Yeah,
knowledge, right?
Yeah, I think it is quite important, as we know. As Chinese, we know that like when we're watching the films in a different region and they are speaking different dialects, we know that they're speaking Chinese, but in different dialects. But for Western audiences, they just know like this is Chinese, and they don't know any like dialects which slightly different. Like when we, as you have mentioned, like the audience reception, we know that they are from China, but in different regions, they're speaking different dialects. But for Western audiences, they just know that this is a Chinese film. For example, like there's a film called 爱情神话, like Be For Busy. They use, I think it's quite a good film which use Shanghai dialects, which we cannot understand. We cannot understand anything about Shanghai dialects, but we know like this is a typical Shanghai story, like from China, from a major city. I think it's quite important. So also in your presentation, you just mentioned like both studio filmmaking, right, and also independent art films. Primarily after like 2000, many independent films arise, and many of them constitute what you have said, like regional new wave. So what do you think are the differences between like this kind of studio filmmaking or state production and independent filmmaking? What do you think are the like kind of similarities and differences when they are representing a region?
Oh, yes, I think this is a really good question, but sometimes they have the connections. For example, like there's a film called The Piano, at the Factories, made in 2010. Actually, these films was one representative in the Northeast New Wave. Some people say this film is the start of the Northeast New Wave, but this film actually is partly sponsored by the Liaoning Film Studio, because this film is set in Liaoning province. And but at the same time, I think nowadays we do not have any like state-owned provincial filmmaking, because a lot of like film studios, they just were closed down, and they got bankruptcy, and in the late 1990s. So probably some companies still are existing nowadays, but a majority of them probably they were just closed down. But I think independent cinemas probably they started being active since the late 1990s, right? But at the time, why we have the independent studies? Because a lot of filmmakers at the time, they cannot find, the economic, support from the film studios. So they began, self-funded, right? Self-funded for their film project. So I think this is there is a difference between there is a difference of the production context in different period. But yes, I think that because a majority of the film studios I mentioned in this presentation, they were state-owned studios, so probably they would emphasize some like the socialist values, because especially some films made in 1950s, 1960s, at that time. So probably most of the films just show up, the socialist is the best society, right? Something like. But I think we should locate different films in different contexts and to.
Yeah, I think for like many like state-owned or studio filmmaking, most of them are, or we characterize them as main melody films, like
main melody films.
Yeah, some of them are representing war films. For example, Northeast China, most of them made by like studio filmmaking, which representing Northeast, still representing Korean War, like most of them, like But I like this kind of I think a kind of a collective memory sometimes like inform, like they always, as you say, like they are forming like a socialist value. But for independent art films, they are more diverse. Right? They are more like focuses on many areas that the studio films cannot cover, like poverty or some other topics. But as you mentioned, like this becomes quite ambiguous, as independent cinema nowadays in China has not seriously challenged, actually, based on several laws that published by the by the government, I think. So I think the final question from me is a kind of a broader question, like it is also open up to the to our audiences, is that how do Western audiences get to know more about Chinese regional cinema? How can like these films be promoted in Western countries? Or how is there a new way we can encourage Western audiences to see Chinese cinema like in a new way, or to highlights their regionality in that case?
Firstly, I think for the Western audiences, maybe study Chinese. So probably I think for a lot of people, they should understand there are different kind of Chinese language in China. So maybe a lot of language probably they sound quite different from Mandarin, right? For example. Also, secondly, I think this is an issue about the soft power, right? Soft power. I think soft power mostly when when Chinese cinema is related to soft power, it's really just considered as the national soft powers, how the China to promote the Chinese cinema internationally. So yes, in China, the Chinese government usually launched this kind of project and to promote the films to be released internationally. It's about the national soft power, but in the same time, I think it's also about the local soft power, because we have a lot of provincial government, we have a lot of like municipal government, so probably they would they would promote their specific image to international. For example, like the place where I'm working, so I'm working in Ningbo, but a majority of colleagues I work with, because my university is the University of Nottingham, is a Chinese campus of a UK's university. But a lot of my colleagues, before they apply for this job, they never heard about anything about this city, right? So probably they just when they found out that there is a vacancy, job vacancy, and online in the jobs.ac.uk, and they would know, oh, there is a Chinese campus of a UK university in Ningbo, and they would learn more about this city, right? So, but I think this is about soft power, right? So how a city promote the image, how a province, promote the image. So this is
yeah. I think it is quite important, especially when you consider like what you have said, like the soft power. But I think I also think that in promoting a kind of a film that carries strong regional characteristic, it is also a good way we can do to do a little compare and contrast methods when like marketing a film in the Western world, because I think China is so big, right? There are certainly some cities in other countries who have similar situations, like in with Chinese provinces. Like for example, Northeast China, as you have said it before, is a post-industrial region, and that post-industrial situation might be somehow similar to some cities, say in Britain, such as like Manchester. We don't know. Like I think there are some similarities can be spot between like these areas. Like when marketing the film, thus when marketing the Chinese regional like film in Britain, we can do a little compare and contrast and say like, come to see a film that's about a city that is similar to post-industrial Manchester, let's say. I think in order to attract more like local audiences to see like such films, in order to like build a kind of connections in that case.
Yeah, it's right. I think this is similar to the UK cities, right? For example, recently I also work for the student recruitment, because I want because our university wants or faculty and to attract Chinese students to come to study in our universities. But a lot of like there's the student parents ask me some question like, is it your university, the University of Nottingham? But what's the difference between the Nottingham and Nottingham? Because they learned about the Nottingham, because they know Nottingham is a very famous because of a Hollywood romantic film, right? But they never heard about the Nottingham. Nottingham, Nottingham is city, right? It's a UK city. So but so this is about the local soft power. How a local place, market themselves to the others.
This kind of relating to the knowledge gap, I think.
Knowledge gap, right?
So I think that's brilliant. So now I think we can like open the floor to the public, to the audiences. So if you have any questions, please feel free to like raise your hand or to tap into the chat box in this meeting, or you can just turn on your microphone.
Okay, so I want to say to Jill, thank you for your listening to my presentation. So I feel really honored and to share this knowledge about Chinese cinema to all the audiences, who come to hear, in this Friday afternoon, right?
Hi, hello.
Hi.
Hi, can anybody hear me? Yes, I just want to ask one quick question because
Yeah.
I've been concerning about how urbanization, or let's say the trend of so-called over-urbanization, would destroy the regional, especially geographical characters of one province, or especially in a not urban area, but rural area. Do you think it would diminish, or let's say kind of a little bit destroy the so-called new wave of regional cinema?
Wow, this is a really interesting question. Yeah. But I think about the relationship between the the urbanization and the regional cinemas. I think, in my opinion, I think we have to locate these questions in a certain context. I think in different contexts, probably how this issue is represented would be different. For example, in Beijing, I remember one scholar just wrote about how the urbanization changed the cultural landscape of the Beijing, because a lot like the Beijing's historical heritage, like those small alleys in the downtowns, they were demolished. So some films probably try to represent this kind of demolition in Beijing. But in Hangzhou, I think this is ongoing because Beijing probably is the top one city, so probably is completely modernized. But Hangzhou now just this kind of urbanization is really prevalent. So probably recent films made there, so probably emphasize this kind of issue. But these should be discussed contextually. About rural areas, yeah, I think these are really interesting questions about rural areas. So probably, I don't think a lot of art house films, they show these kind of representations, because I think this kind of issue, is a little bit politically, sensitive. So, but I usually found this kind of theme in the documentaries. For example, like how do you say? So some documentaries probably would show these kind of urban rural conflicts during the urbanization. For example, like wow, I forgot some film titles. Anyway, but because the narrative films, I think if they want to get the dragon seals, probably they hardly touch something really political, politically sensitive, in my opinion. Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Thank you for your question. Yeah, great.
Thank you for your question. Does anyone else have some questions?
Any question? Okay. I don't think there would be more questions.
I have one final question.
Okay. Okay, come on.
This kind of this kind of, can we also situate this kind of a Chinese regional cinema, which relates to a concept such as national or transnational, to form a kind of a flow, from regional to national to transnational cinema in that case?
It's a huge question. Oh my gosh. So yeah, I think about, so some people say, okay, this, sometimes the localities, also should be discussed, in a background of nationality or transnationality. For example, like the films, Wisdom Tooth. So if you haven't seen this film, you could find out this film. So probably it just shows a kind of locality in the Northeast China, but it's trying to emphasize, the community of the Chinese Korean, because actually I interviewed with this director before. So the filmmaker trying to show, these kind of relationships between the China and the North Korea, in this region. So, a lot like, the North Koreans, so they escaped, the North Korean regime and to the Northeast China. And they also, just lived there. So it lived a huge community of the Chinese Korean, in the Northeast China. So in this film, you could find a lot the posters written in Korean. Some characters probably they speak Korean, I forgot, but because I saw this film 3 years ago, probably. But that film you can see that this locality is constructed, in a kind of, transnational issue, right? It's about the international relations, right? So, but these international relations, cause a certain local phenomena happening in these contexts where this film is set.
Yeah, that's really great. Thank you. I think Lily has asked one question in the chat. I'm really interested to know if films from the Inner Mongolia New Wave or Tibetan New Wave can have performed in terms of box office success, etc., compared to other waves such as Hangzhou. Are they as successful, or is there still progress to be made? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think they have some achievement in the film festivals. For example, about Tibetan New Waves, some filmmakers like Pam Taidan, he won a lot of film awards, internationally. For example, his last films was selected in the Venice Film Festival, and so I think it got a lot of attentions from the film Odysseys, also from the film business, to sell his film, internationally, right? About the Inner Mongolia New Wave, yes. For example, some filmmakers like Zhang Dalei, he won the first film festival. Was the leading, art house film festival, but it's oriented to incubate new filmmakers. So actually, Franklin and I published something about this film festival last year in Senses of Cinemas. So if you're interested in the first film festivals, you could look at that festival report published in Senses of Cinemas. So I think a lot of filmmakers I mentioned, they just win a lot of awards in some film festivals nationally, like the first film festival, or some like international film festival like Rotterdam or like Venice or Cannes. But yeah, they are art house films, right? New waves film, just like I think just like the typical new waves films. They just serve the cinephiles, the audiences who have interest in art films, but compared to those blockbusters or like I don't think they could achieve a huge success in box office, I guess. But wait, yeah, recently I also have some interest in animation, because recently I also feel like the animation get localized. I remember, probably last year also Odyssey brought a film about the line, about the line dance, that? But that film is set in Canton. Also, that film was completely spoken in Cantonese, if I remember correctly. But that film is a localized animation, feature animation, right?
Yeah, it's called I Am What I Am.
I Am What I Am. Yeah, it's a
熊市少女
Cantonese animation. Yeah, but that film I remember it got a huge box office success, because the market in Canton for this animation is huge. Yeah, a lot of Cantonese audience really like these films.
Yeah. Thank you, Zhaoyu, and thank you, Lily, for your question. Yeah, I think there are lots of potential, I think, for this kind of regional cinema. So thank you, everyone, for attending this panel discussion. Hope you have learned something new of an approach to Chinese cinema. In the end, if you are interested in watching these films, we have mentioned in our presentation or in our discussion, including Dwelling in the Future Mountains, Wisdom Tooth, please visit our website as I type in the chat box, like odysseychinesecinema.uk. To watch this film, the Chinese regional cinema sessions began on the 3rd of June. Right? So after 3rd of June, you can watch these titles in our platform. So thank you again for attending, and hope you enjoyed our panel discussion, and we will see you. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye. Take care.
Bye.